Going overseas now, a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip has been attacked by Israeli warplanes. Gaza's health ministry says at least 33 people were killed and dozens more injured after the air raid on the Makazi refugee camp in central Gaza. Search and rescue teams continue to search through the rubble for more victims. The camp is located in the evacuation zone, where Israel's military has urged Palestinian civilians in Gaza to seek refuge as it focuses its military offensive at the north. The Palestine Red Crescent Society says they have also been hearing heavy explosions near the Al-Quds Hospital in Gaza. The PCRS claims a building about 50 meters from the hospital has been targeted by IDF, and that they say there are casualties. It says rescue teams aren't able to leave the hospital due to heavy shelling in the area. Powerful explosions lit up the night sky in Gaza. The strikes come a day after Israel said it would press on with its offensive to crush the territory's Hamas rulers, despite U.S. appeals for a pause to get aid to desperate civilians. Israel has accused Hamas of using civilians as human shields. And those developments come after Israeli forces hit an ambulance outside of the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza late Friday night, killing at least 15 civilians. The IDF says Hamas was using the ambulance to transport weapons, and a number of militants were also killed. And for more on those incidents, we're joined live by Joseph Belliveau, who is the executive director for Doctors Without Borders Canada. Joseph, thank you for joining us today. A lot coming out of the Gaza Strip. Of course, that ambulance attack, according to Twitter, your organization put out that there was staff on the ground at the time. So walk us through what your staff are telling you about what happened that day, including any communications they might have had with the IDF before making that transport.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So indeed, a number of my colleagues, doctors and nurses, were right at the gate of the hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital, when that strike hit the ambulance right out front. They witnessed it. They describe a very bloody scene, bodies on the ground. Of course, they immediately went out to retrieve the injured that they could and brought them immediately into the operating theater. Now, this takes place within the context of a hospital that is barely functioning. In fact, we can say that the health system as a whole in Gaza is really failing at the moment. So my doctors and nurse colleagues are describing a situation inside Al-Shifa and the other functioning hospitals in which the building, the structures is literally falling down. The notion of having separate wards has completely disappeared. So there's just patients and people seeking safety sort of all over the hospital. They're performing surgeries wherever they can. The operating theater is completely overwhelmed, hallways full of injured. They're performing surgeries in the hallways, sometimes amputations and really brutal surgeries on children as well. The one doctor was describing how they've run out of painkillers, but also infection treatments, and they're literally using vinegar now to treat infections. So the functioning of these hospitals is absolutely desperate. Now, you asked, to what extent have our teams and these hospitals been asked to evacuate? Indeed, there's been repeated calls to evacuate these facilities. One of my colleagues put it bluntly and very simply: where shall they go? There is no safe place to go in Gaza. There are no other functioning facility, or I should say the functioning medical facilities that are available are completely overwhelmed and overrun, lacking blood, lacking clean water, lacking gauze, painkillers, as I said, operating instruments, and so on and so forth. The whole health system is just at its knees.
And you say it yourself, with this lack of safety zones, we saw attacks on refugee centers in this alleged safe zones that Israel did tell people move from the north to the south. They were still bombed there anyway. What kind of position does that put groups like yours in when there is no actual safety zones to go to, and when every attack is justified by allegations of Hamas militants being there?
It's an impossible situation, and maybe first off, on that last the bombing of the refugee camp of Jabalia that you referred to, shortly after that bombing, MSF started to receive, that hospital, in fact, Al-Shifa started to receive the injured and the wounded, waves of them, many severely injured, and amongst them a number of small children with bad burn wounds and bad shrapnel injuries and so on. And this pattern has become so repeated and so bad that they've developed a new acronym for it. Wounded Children, No Surviving Family, WCNSF, an acronym to describe how common this phenomenon is of children being wounded, having lost their families. In that particular instance, my doctor colleague was describing how children are just terrified and in pain. So, you know, this notion of the repeated violations of international humanitarian law in an egregious manner in which civilians are being actively, it's hard to imagine that anything else but active targeting is happening. Certainly measures to protect non-combatants and civilians are being completely flouted in this conflict, partly by this incessant bombing that we're hour by hour we're still experiencing, and partly by the siege warfare, which is also an indiscriminate form of warfare in which you're withholding essential elements, fuel, food, water, medical supplies from civilians who need it desperately.
Let's talk a little bit about the Trudeau government's hands in all this. Many officials, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau himself, have been very vocal about the need to get aid into Gaza. They've been very vocal about the need for a humanitarian pause. They say they're advocating for as much. But then we see the Canadian ambassador to the UN voting against a resolution to achieve just that. How do you feel seeing those two dynamics from the federal government in Canada?
Look, I see it from the perspective of humanitarian organization, humanitarian medical organization, and what we continue to witness is something of a scale and a severity that is becoming more and more difficult to describe, just how much civilians are heeding the brunt of it. One of my colleagues, for example, they're living in such fear all of the time. And so on a whiteboard in one of the hospitals where they used to write the weekly surgical cases, they're so overwhelmed with surgical cases, they simply erased that whiteboard and put, we did what we could, remember us. They're at the verge of just not knowing when the next bomb is going to drop and whether their lives are going to be lost in that next event. So when we ask about governments, including the Canadian government, and their positioning around this, we can't but call for a complete ceasefire, and we should be putting all of our energies, we're not a political organization, but the political powers who can influence this situation should be putting all of their energies toward a complete ceasefire, not a pause. A pause would just signal, okay, a timeout for a period of time, and then maybe we'll go back to the bombing. What's happening right now is unconscionable and completely inhumane. So we need a complete ceasefire. That's first and foremost what our government and other governments should be calling for. Then you talk about access to humanitarian aid. Indeed, the borders are still incredibly restricted, even though we've had a few good news stories. MSF has been able to get out 22 of our colleagues. Some tiny trickle of humanitarian aid has been able to come across the border, but we've all heard the stories. I mean, before October 7th, hundreds of humanitarian trucks, this was an aid-dependent context already, hundreds of humanitarian trucks were coming in every single day. And since October 7th, we've seen, 100, maybe a little over 100 trucks. So we desperately, first off, need a ceasefire, the stop of the bombing. And then secondly, we need these borders to open up so that we can get these desperately needed food, water, medical supplies, and fuel in.
And Joseph, my last question for you here. The Trudeau government has put forward a matching fund for aid relief in Gaza and the West Bank. There's been some criticism from smaller charities about the short list that are actually able to be part of that matching fund. Have you heard anything about that? And if so, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
That's not our preoccupation at the moment. We appreciate what the government is doing to try to increase funding for humanitarian organizations. And I know that a lot of humanitarian organizations, including MSF, are in full scale-up mode. So we have logistics teams and medical teams throughout the region, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and throughout the whole region, really ready we have trucks loaded with medical supplies. We have teams who are ready to get in. But right now, the circumstances are not sufficient to allow the flow of people and aid that will be necessary for months to come. This is going to be a massive humanitarian response for months to come, if and when the conditions allow that response. So I really appreciate what the government is doing, what other organizations are doing to try to get ready. First, I come back. First and foremost, the bombing has to stop.
Okay, very clear call there. Joseph Belliveau, the Executive Director for Doctors Without Borders in Canada, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.